Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
This is the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Thanks so much for picking this podcast. Let's face it, when you're looking at the world of podcasts, there are over 2 million choices that are out there. And yet, hopefully you come back week after week to this show, because this is the podcast that was designed to be a resource for those who work in and around product lifecycle management. The Digital Enterprise Society is a forum for the exchange of ideas surrounding the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, go visit the website, digitalenterprisesociety.org. My name is Thom Singer, and I have the honor to host this show every single week. I usually am co-hosting it with Craig Brown. Craig is an industry veteran and former PLM leader at General Motors. However, every now and then, it's just me and the guest. These shows are our career development shows where I bring in an expert who is going to have a lot of interesting ideas that are going to help all of you find ways to enhance and grow your careers. And today, we're going to have an interesting conversation. Today, we're going to talk about why diversity matters and understanding unconscious bias. And our guest is Deborah Biddle. Hey, Deborah, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Well, for those of you who don't know Deborah Biddle, she comes alongside individuals and organizations to help them understand how to think better, do better, and be better about building relationships and community at work and where they live. Now, she is a certified diversity professional. She's a coach, a workshop presenter, and a business leader. In fact, she was in management leadership with 2 different Fortune 500 companies, and she is an expert when it comes to training and development and employee management. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and why this all matters. Now, some of you might be thinking, hey, I'm not the boss. I don't hire people. Why is this a topic that we're going to be discussing today? But Deborah, this matters to everybody, right?
Yes, it does. It's important because we all have relationships we're involved in. We all live in a place that's ever changing, and we are trying to do that to the best of our abilities and do it in a way that is more winsome rather than confrontational. So it's helpful for us to think about how we engage one another, especially across differences.
Well, and every study that I've seen come out says that when a company and a team or any organization has more diversity, they make more money, they have better success because you're bringing in a lot of different ideas and thoughts and things like that. But for people who are listening, why do they fit into this whole discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think because we all have values, we have beliefs, we have experiences that make us unique. We often talk about diversity in terms of majority and minority culture, but it's a little bit bigger and a little bit deeper than that. We have diversity characteristics, and I like to think about it in terms of our diversity dimensions. And we have, the model I use has 5 different dimensions. One is our identity, which is the core of who we are and how we define ourselves. Then our primary identity, which is based on those things about us that tend not to change over time. The things that are inherent in who we are, like our age, our class, our gender, our sexual orientation, those kinds of things. Then our secondary dimensions, which are the things we learn over time, like language, where we went to school, what our religious beliefs or our political beliefs are, our marital status, whether we have kids or not. And then we look at the organizational piece, which really is about where we literally are within the organizations we're a part of, whether it's school or work, whether we're a first-year student or a 4th year or 5th year in some cases.
I was there 5.5 years, but the only person who was counting was my dad, who had to pay the tuition.
Well, there you go. And when you think about the workplace, whether you're the brand new person or you're the CEO, you're tenured or non-tenured, union or non-union. And then that cultural piece, that is just how we, whether we were a doer or a beer, whether we like conflict or not, whether we're cooperative or competitive, or whether we're the kind of person that kind of goes with the flow, or we have to have a whole lot of structure. So when you look at it that way, when you go beyond race and gender and age, then you can see that we all are very unique, and there are multiple aspects and layers about who we are. So it's not just the other person that is different and unique. We all have that. And so when we think about it that way, then I think talking about diversity and inclusion is a little more accessible for us.
I find that interesting because I haven't heard a lot of people lead with it that way. But if you listen to your definition, all of us are diversity, because I might be older than somebody else, or I come from a different background, or have a different political belief. And it doesn't make me right or wrong. It just makes me part of the diversity of equation of where I work or whatever community I'm a part of. So let's start diving into this. I'd like to start with sort of a definition of DEI. The term is being used a lot lately. We hear it coming up in every business meeting that we attend and stuff like that. But what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? What is the definition of the words?
So when you think diversity, I like to think about it in terms of a question. So in its most basic form, diversity is just people or things or places that are unique. When it comes to people, it's people with different experiences or identities or perspectives. But I like the question, who's in the room? So who is it that is on your staff, on your team, within your department? Who's in your leadership? Who's in your community? Who engages with you on a day-to-day basis? That is the diversity that exists. When we're talking about equity, it is about the elimination of barriers that exist among people, the ability of our ability to eliminate any barriers to advancement or opportunity based on any social or cultural factors. And the question I ask when I'm thinking about diversity is who gets? So who gets supported? Who gets the information? Who gets listened to? What community gets served? Who gets hired? Who gets promoted? Organizationally, that's what I think about when it comes to equity. And when we're talking about inclusion, that's really us creating an environment, whether it's at home or at school or in the workplace, where people are involved, they're respected, there's a connection, and there are these ideas that get exchanged from all sorts of backgrounds and perspectives. So the question I would ask is, who is valued? So who is sharing and speaking and contributing? Who is heard? Whose ideas are included? Who is the person that's respected? And who feels a sense of belonging? So that's how I think about those.
No, I like that. And I love when we were talking about, the equity is the elimination of barriers. I mean, I know we're making progress in this area across the board in the business world, but are there still a lot of barriers that people face in the business, in their careers?
There are. We hear it all the time, the difference in pay equity. For one, we still have women who are paid significantly less than men. And even if you look at women, Latinx or Hispanic women are paid lower than African-American women, who are paid lower than white women, who are paid lower than Black males, who are paid lower than white males. So there's disparity there, and there are barriers because of bias and perception about who can do jobs better than another person, and so on. And then we've got barriers to access based on ability. So if a person comes into the workplace disabled, typically there are some barriers to access, literally, physically, to the workspace. There's bias that prohibits people from being hired if they have a disability. There are biases based on race, biases based on something as simple as, I prefer to hire people from Northern Illinois University versus University of Wisconsin, so I'm only going to hire those folks. So there's all kinds of barriers we put in place. There are barriers if you are justice involved. It's hard for people to get employment that way. Then there are barriers for women who say, I want to be an executive. We can look across our Fortune 500 companies and beyond and see that the numbers of women, the numbers of people of color, the numbers of people who are gay, the numbers of people who have disabilities are all very, very small when you look and see who's in the leadership role. So I could go on. There's access to information. Sometimes certain people are given the information on a project while others are not. Sometimes people are prohibited because they aren't granted opportunity to advance and be educated, so their careers don't move as fast. So there's all sorts of things that get in the way of people being successful in the workplace.
Well, and that ties into something else that you said about inclusion was, who feels connected and who feels respected. How can companies work to make sure that everyone who works for them feels connected and respected? I mean, what are some of the steps that can be taken to make sure that we're having that in the workplace?
First, you have to set out to have that as a goal and a value organizationally. Some organizations are really explicit about saying, we want this to be a place where everyone's ideas are valued and respected, where people are treated equitably, and we want to have a place where people can thrive. Some people just flat out say that. And once they do that, then it requires you to actually look at your processes, practices, and procedures to see, is there anything obvious or anything inherent in the way that we do things that prohibits someone of a particular background or a particular life experience or particular identity that keeps them from being successful here. And it could be what we've most recently experienced is coronavirus. If we had said everyone has to come to work regardless, then we would have exposed people to illness. And, that wouldn't have been a good situation. So we made the switch. We became more flexible. We allowed people to work from home. We created all sorts of opportunity for people to get the computers and workstations and so forth that they needed at home. So that was an accommodation we made so that we could eliminate a barrier of people not being able to do their jobs. It could be flexible scheduling. That could be something that we look at in order to have more people be able to work and be successful at it. Thinking about the ways that we communicate our information. I think we've done a good job utilizing technology and just making sure that people get it. But something as simple as translation services for people who need Braille, for people who need sign language, for people who need something translated in French or Spanish or Mandarin or whatever the language may be. How are we going about doing those things? And then thinking about our employees who work multiple shifts. There's a tendency, of course, to do things between the hours of 8 to 5. But if you have second shift and third shift employees, are we providing them the same kinds of training and development opportunities as we provide to our employees who work first shift? So there's a lot of different ways to think about this and a lot of different areas. Our HR practices, where do we go to recruit? If we say that our goal is to have more diversity, ethnic and racial diversity in our organizations, what kind of recruiting are we doing? Have we built up our own personal network so that we have diverse, racially and ethnically diverse people in our network, in our personal network? Because we know that most people get their jobs through networking, like 85%. So if my personal network isn't very diverse and I'm trying to recruit people who are ethnically and racially diverse, then I'm not able to do that if I'm not practicing what I'm preaching in terms of diversity. So just thinking about those kinds of things. Are we reaching out beyond our immediate sphere of influence to try to make a difference in our organization in terms of who we hire, who we retain, and who we advance?
So you bring up a kind of an interesting point that I hadn't thought of, and that is all the changes that happened because of, the COVID issues and working from home and now coming back hybrid and being able to let people have more flexible schedules. And many companies, not all, are open to what's best for the employee, and different employees have different things. Does this play into this world of DEI also? Is the flexibility in scheduling and work from home and hybrid, does that all fit in as well?
It does. It answers two questions. It answers, what are we doing from an equity perspective? Are we creating a situation where the most people can have access and opportunity to employment, fair pay, the tools they need to do their work, and so on? And then are people feeling included in terms of the decisions they can make, in terms of advocating for themselves and being able to contribute and thrive at work? And some companies have made this transition period really great for their employees. Others have struggled. And I think some of that depends on the type of work that people do in the industry that they're involved in. Where we're seeing issues now from an equity perspective is employees who are saying, or employers who are saying, we want our employees to come back to the office. And they're deciding based on what seems like the type of job people have and other criteria, which I don't know. But the problem that some employees are having is they're saying, we were able to do this work when everyone was panicked about COVID. We didn't lose productivity. In fact, in some cases, our productivity was higher. We were more effective. And we save money because we stayed at home, and now you're making us come back to work. So that's a question that employers are having to analyze and say, what are we gaining by having people come back to the office? And what might it be costing us? And is it equitable? Is it inclusive to make people come back, or should we give people the flexibility of choosing?
So I want to go back to something we were talking about a second ago, and that was around bias. And you had a lot of examples around different things that bring up bias. But in the introduction, I was quoting the title of one of your workshops, which is Why Diversity Matters and Understanding Unconscious Bias. I want to touch on this term unconscious bias because we hear it a lot, but I'm not sure people really understand it. And I think it scares some people because they think, well, I'm not biased. So what is unconscious bias, and why is this something we all should be aware of?
Well, the formal definition of it is that it's about the attitudes or the stereotypes that can be affecting our understanding and our actions, as well as our decisions in an unconscious way. So think about the associations that we harbor in our subconscious that cause us to have certain feelings and attitudes based on people's characteristics. So it could be anything from race or age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, identity, or appearance. Those are the kinds of things that people typically will have a bias around. And I know a lot of scholars have said, well, everyone has a bias about something, and most of us do, but we don't often recognize it. And that's the tricky thing about it being an unconscious bias. I think our minds get programmed a little bit, and we forget about the things that we are really impacted by and ingrained by. For instance, if I give you a slogan and I ask you to tell me the product, you'll probably know. So I'm going to give you a few. Just do it.
Nike.
Can you hear me now?
Verizon.
Taste the rainbow.
Skittles.
And eat fresh. That one's trickier.
Oh.
Subway.
Yeah, there you go.
So we've heard these things back in the day. Marketers used to want you to hear something or see something about their product 40 times a day at least. So think about all the radio, television, print media, and now all of the social media that we have. We see and hear these slogans numerous times a day. And when you think about a week or a year, and it's ingrained into our subconscious. So when we think about gym shoes or think about, chicken, we automatically think Kentucky Fried Chicken. And there have been studies that show whatever we're first introduced to, if we go into a grocery store and we've been hearing about Frosted Flakes for the last 6 weeks, we're probably going to buy Frosted Flakes as opposed to some other kind of cereal. So that's a little bit how unconscious bias works, where we're thinking about, we've been indoctrinated about something, and we make choices based out of our bias towards it. And sometimes those choices can be innocuous and there are things we like and maybe even things that are good for us. But sometimes, because we've been indoctrinated in the negative sense, they're not. And that's where the problem comes in.
So when our listeners are kind of all over the map in their career level, we have some entry level people, we have some senior people inside manufacturing companies, and everyone in between. How can the average person who's listening to this, maybe they're not the hiring manager, they're not the person who's putting teams together, how can their being aware of diversity and why it matters, about equity and inclusion, and about avoiding our unconscious biases where they're negative, how can the average person learn from what we're talking today? What's the best advice you have for people that they can take away from this podcast?
I think it's just important for people to recognize that we all have learned different things about people or situations over the course of our life that have given us both positive and negative sentiments or impressions about people. And some of it may be true and some of it isn't. So if we're trying to really operate out of the best place and we find ourselves making questionable decisions or acting in a way that we're surprised we were acting about, there's a few things we can do. And it requires us to just slow down and take a breath. One would be to ask someone where your biases are. If you don't know, ask someone who lives with you. They probably know. Or you can take the implicit association test. You can Google that, and there are several tests you can take that'll give you some insight as to where your biases lie.
What's the name of the test they can take?
Implicit association test.
I said if they just Google that, they'll find a way to log on and take that.
They will find it. You go to the webpage, you have to do a quick registration, and then it'll give you a choice of some short little tests you can take. They're on body type, on gender, age, all kinds of things. And you can choose the ones you want to take, and they take about 10 minutes, and then they'll give you a score and let you know whether you're biased. And then they'll show you how you compare to the rest of the people who have ever taken over 20 million people, I believe, have taken them. Oh, wow. So you'll see all those results. And it's interesting. Some people don't believe it, that it's accurate, but you can judge for yourself once you experience it. But after you do that, then I would say just check your initial thoughts. When you make a decision or you engage with someone new and you start to feel a certain way, just pause long enough to give yourself the opportunity to process and understand what you're thinking and feeling and why you might be doing what you're doing or making the decision you're making. And then question any assumptions you have about people who are different from you and ask yourself, why am I thinking this way? Why do I feel this way? Be logical and ask yourself how many people actually have the characteristic or conform to the actual bias that you have. If you have biases that certain races of people are always this way, or that girls can't do this or that, ask yourself how many people you actually know fit that stereotype. And then analyze yourself and ask yourself what it is that you're experiencing, and is it consistent with your own personal values and beliefs? A lot of times we'll find ourselves saying something or doing something that goes against what we would normally believe to be true. That's a moment for you to check in on what your biases might be. And then if you have any kind of microaggression where you're saying something that is causing someone else to feel unwelcome, or you're intimidating someone else, then check in with that and stop doing it right away. And then take a risk. I think move outside of your comfort zone, try to do something different, engage with people who are different than you are. Traveling, I think, is one of the best ways to overcome some biases, because you get exposed to a broader world and you get to see people in a different light, and you start to recognize that we're a lot more common than we are uncommon. And then try to be intentional and act as if the bias doesn't exist. I think that's just good practice. It's like exercise. The more you practice behaving in an unbiased manner, the more it will become natural for you. And then one of the biggest things we can do is to vary our media intake. So listen to different radio programs, listen to different podcasts, watch different television programs, read different books, read something from a foreign country, something totally different from your normal point of view. And that will help broaden your understanding and break down some of the biases. And then set an intention to be the kind of person that is a connector more than someone who is divisive. And I think those things will help us to be more unbiased every day.
Deborah, that's a lot of information that you shared. A couple of things I want to go back to because you shared so much of it, but I perked up on a couple of things. And one was, get around a variety of different people, travel and see different parts of the world where people come from different types of backgrounds, and watch different types of media. My dad always said that if you're at a dinner party and you're all are voting for the same candidates, you need to invite some different people to your dinner party, because he said if you're just around a little bubble, you're never going to be able to change and grow for the better. And so when you said that, I was like, oh, that was advice I always got as a kid, is make sure you were around people who saw the world. It wasn't just politics, but politics, religion, country of origin. My dad said, when you're around people that are different, you will learn something. So I think that was good. The other thing you touched on just now, and you actually touched on it 15 minutes ago in the interview, and that was diversity in your networking. And we've only got a few minutes left, but I want to touch on this because this is something that I believe in and that I teach the audiences that I speak to, is that when we go to some sort of a business event, I will sit and watch, and what you'll see is the older people will kind of find each other, the Gen Zers or millennials will kind of find each other, groups of women will appear, people will find other, demographic similarities, and they'll be drawn towards people who are like them. But when we have a network of people who are diverse, it's not just good for hiring diversity and things like that. It goes back to what I was just saying. You learn more when you're around that. So how can people build a network of their business connections with people who have more diversity? How can they intentionally do that?
You just set that intention and you start where you are. So don't go out thinking I've got to meet everybody in the entire company who's different. Start in your department, on your team. If there's somebody there that you never do more than say hello to, start with them. A friend of mine did something which I thought was fantastic. She set an intention to meet 52 new people a year. And so she had a coffee date with somebody different every week. So whatever works for you, I think just reaching out beyond that immediate sphere of people that you're always around to try to make touch with somebody new is a great way to go.
Well, Deborah Biddle, thanks for joining us here on the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Any last words of advice for the audience?
Don't be afraid. I think we are so comfortable where we are in our own little bubble, as you said. And I think really the biggest thing about diversity is just stepping outside of your immediate comfort zone and taking a risk and getting to know somebody new. It won't hurt, and it'll change your life in a positive way.
So if somebody needs to have more of Deborah Biddle, how do they find you?
You can reach me at Deb Biddle at ppl-co.com, or you can find me, Deborah Biddle, on LinkedIn or Facebook, or look at my website, www.ppl-co.com.
Well, Deborah Biddle, I so appreciate you. I'm glad that our paths cross. I hope they cross again. And thank you to everybody who tuned in and listened. We try every single week to bring these interesting interviews that are going to help you think differently and grow your career. So please, if you're a regular listener of the show, make sure that you're telling everyone you know who works in the world of product lifecycle management about this podcast. If you're new to the show, come back every single week, because we're going to have more thoughts, ideas, and actionable information in and around your career in product lifecycle management. The Digital Enterprise Society is the place for the exchange of ideas around digital manufacturing tools. Go check us out at digitalenterprisesociety.org.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.